Calling to order this meeting of the Cleveland Heights City Council Housing and Building Committee at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, May 14th. Clerk Ballister, if you wouldn't mind, could you please call the roll?
Larson. Here. Petrus.
Here.
Kuda. Here. Maddox.
And let the record reflect that Councilman Maddox will be joining us over Zoom. We also have Director Zamp, Director Butler, and Director Hanna. And then we also have guests, Gary Benjamin and Melody Hart with us this afternoon. So first on the agenda is an overview of the City of Cleveland's Residents First program. So Director Zamp, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure, and we have, maybe I'll do this as a share screen just in case. Councilman Maddox comes on board. So we have before you here, this is essentially the presentation that the City of Cleveland gave as they engaged in this Residents First process. And Assistant Director Butler and I will probably tag team on this presentation, just to give you a brief overview. In terms of broad strokes, it's always a good idea to look at your processes and your ordinances and make sure that they are up to date, they align with the problems, and try to have the solutions. And so that's really what they attempted to do here in Cleveland, particularly when they had a new housing director come in from South Euclid, and many of the things that she learned in her over 10 years in South Euclid. But this presentation really does a great job. And you can see they talk about, what they were trying to accomplish with this, which is, focus on those out of town investors and a solution to that was having an in-town agent, using some new ticketing, and then looking at vacant buildings. Again, they really went into here why they were trying to do this. And a lot of this is related to a property inventory or condition study that they did both in 2015 and then they updated it in 2022, 2023. So they took stock of what their properties were and what condition they were in, and then they said, given that and sort of a deterioration that they saw over that 5-6 year period, they wanted to sort of revamp how they were doing things. So this is actually a different version of the presentation that we wanted to present, but they talk about, hey, there's a vacant building crisis in town. And so there's a lot of statistics here. So one of the solutions, which I'll throw it to Alan, is a local agent in charge, LAIC.
Right, so as Eric mentioned, when Sally took over in Cleveland, she was pretty advanced in doing some of her things in South Euclid, the ordinances that they had and what seemed to work. When you go to Cleveland, it's a little bit different atmosphere, a little larger city, right? And trying to get the same problems that we all have on a bigger scale and what needs to be revamped. So to her credit, they used the property survey to do that data analysis, and then had a bunch of input from other departments, law department, some outside realtors, the planning department, to come up with these changes they made, and then adding these ordinances to their laws that they didn't have before. So the local agent in charge is basically their version of our out-of-county owner registration. Basically says, hey, we're putting somebody local, to accept service on any notices or summonses that appear, and they have to file an affidavit for it.
So civil ticketing, another thing.
Right. So allowing for civil penalties or fines on whatever violation they deem valid for those tickets. Right. We do it for trash, for grass cutting, certain things like that, and so they're adding those civil penalties for whatever violations they need.
And so
Right. So here's the list of typical nuisances or violations that they're going to assess a civil penalty for.
So just for clarification, they did not already do that? Is that right?
I haven't reviewed their old ordinances, but I'm assuming if they're putting it in there, they're either adding different types, categories for civil penalty, or they didn't have it before.
They were
And-
mostly criminal,
Yeah, so,
what they were doing.
Yeah.
So in terms of using the term civil and criminal, when people appear in housing court, they've been charged with a criminal offense. At this level that they're at, it's just at the initial complaint stage, so it's considered a civil offense?
correct, it's basically just a civil penalty that they can assess right at the time, you know, there's an appeal process, but, you know, you put your trash out early, right? Here's the penalty for that.
Okay, thank you.
Chairman Petrus, just to note, I just admitted in Councilman Maddox.
Okay, great.
Next time, this is the registry overhaul.
Yeah, so this is basically, Cleveland had a rental registry. I think they're just adding some different changes to it, requirements for it, so that it's, you know, in line with their new process. I think the next step that they did add a vacant registration on here, which they didn't have in the past. So they're requiring a vacant property be registered with the city. Yeah, and then to define right where you go in your rental registration process, there's some flow charts to say, how do I identify it? Are you living there? Are you living elsewhere? And trying to find that information that they're lacking in the current process.
Okay, you want to talk about this, please?
Yeah, so they're adding, looks like some steps here for title transfer on residential and or commercial properties. And I want to say this is in lieu of a point of sale inspection. So they're requiring either a cash bond or a contractor's bond for certain amounts if there's, on this for the non-residential by square footage. And for the residential, I believe it was a straight dollar amount is what I read.
Chairman Petrus, do we have a vacant building registry?
Yes.
So the data that you get from our survey will also help facilitate that and make sure that it's clear that what you have for listings on that registry matches what's actually out there on the street.
Absolutely. They should, hopefully they're identical, but yeah, even if there's a larger number or ones that are suspect on the survey,
Yeah.
we'll do some follow-up and see if they're actually vacant, and then, yeah, add them to our registration and requirements.
So for clarification, if a property is vacant, does someone have to actively notify the city of that? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, they have to complete the registration. There's a fee included with that registration for processing, and assign a local agent, right? Just like the other processes. We'll do an inspection on it to make sure it's being maintained. We have other registrations for rental if it becomes a rental, right? So if they do occupy, how long, if they do occupy a partial time of the year, right? What's the requirement for that, and how long are they staying there, right? So once we identify it, we reach out to them, they give us the information we need, then we can, use that information to contact them if there's an issue.
What about the scenario when someone just abandons a property?
So, and we still have it listed under our ordinances or in our system as a vacant, and it needs a registration, whether it's paid for or applied or not. And those are the ones that we're gonna track down, right? Those are the ones that, the vacant and abandoned properties are the ones that, we're targeting to make sure that they get through the system, right? Whether it's tax delinquency, tax foreclosure, nuisance abatement, right? It's gotta get to a productive status.
So in my research, one of the things I found is that some of these local property management companies and the local agents themselves take on hundreds of people. You know, it's like a kind of a cash cow. How do we monitor and what could we do about local property agents that really aren't doing their job?
So, I mean, just like any
Like a landlord.
violation, right, it would be, what job aren't you doing? Are there violations in the house that you're not maintaining, right? So, I mean, we just use the ordinance to do it.
But we can't
Just to say
regulate.
that somebody has, multiple, right, you think he's overextended on it, right, isn't necessarily a violation in our book, but, right, the quality of the property, does it have flaking paint, does it have broken windows, have you gotten your property registration, the rental, have we done the rental inspection? Right, and then if not, we recommend it for a summons to court.
So if there's a property management company that's, just had numerous complaints, and then, there's some new landlord that hires that person, there's really nothing we can do about that.
Legally, I'm not gonna give recommendations to one way or another for a property management company, but again, right, if they're not in compliance with our ordinances, for whatever property we're looking at the time, we'll escalate it to a summons.
So inspecting parking garages.
So this is something a little unique to them more than us. Typically, our parking garages are gonna be all city-owned, but right, with some of the recent press, and in the news where we had some collapses in other cities, I'm sure they wanna make sure that the parking garages are safe. So they're adding this ordinance.
We spoke about that. Civil.
And, again, I haven't reviewed their ordinances previously, but a very effective tool for me is nuisance abatement. And when we see an issue, we post notice. If it doesn't get fixed in a timely manner and it is a health and safety issue, we hire out to have it abated. And so I think they're just revamping their abatement authority to make it more convenient for them. So certificate of disclosure, I'm assuming is basically an affidavit, basically stating that, hey, I am the authority on it. I'm stating it, right? The buck stops with me and they want it notarized and by whoever's signing it.
So I'll handle this one, and this one is just sort of getting all of the related but separate ordinances and departments to talk to each other. So you can see here even in the title, building, housing, zoning, health, fire, and sidewalks codes in their case, all talking to each other. Very often you make a change in one code and it impacts another one, and departments sometimes only are focusing in on what they're doing in one place. This is a lot of what we're talking about with the short-term rental legislation, is making sure that it's matching what we're doing in other places in our code. So consistency and clarification, of course, is really important. And since this is the actual red presentation, one of the really good things they have in here is that in the beginning, they show all the people that were involved in these discussions. And I think they just put it really well. These proposed code changes were developed through a collaborative process spanning more than 6 months, and they had this working group of council, a sort of abandoned property action council, the building and housing leadership, including the planning folks, and then a whole bunch of attorneys, because it's really important that law is involved in that. One of the things that we've heard from folks over there, and you can sort of see it in the press, is for them to do this, there's a lot of hiring that they need to do. And I think we put ourselves through council in pretty good shape in terms of what we're already doing. But certainly as we have this collaborative conversation, there might come a point where we say, we don't have the capacity to do that. And I think it's important to get those out early and often, because that's sort of where they're running into trouble right now, is they just don't have enough inspectors to enforce these new laws.
As you reviewed Cleveland's initiative, did you come across parts of it that could be used to amend our codified regulations for housing code so that it would strengthen the codes that we have in place? Are there things that they're doing that would strengthen our regulations?
I'm gonna give you a non-inspector answer, which is what they did really well here is they packaged this together and they almost rebranded it, which I think is important. In terms of the actual technical elements, Alan would be better to speak to that. And just to sort of return to the introduction is they were much further behind than certainly South Euclid and us. So there's always room for improvement, and I think that's going to be our approach, is not to start from scratch, but to really improve our processes and our codes, and looking at this and looking at other codes that may come across the table. But I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, when I have reviewed this, just a snapshot of what I've gotten here, what came to my mind is to look at what they're doing and then look at what we have, right? I think ours is pretty robust on all the ordinances, all the regulations and restrictions we do, the point of sales, the foreclosure bond, the tax delinquent rental restrictions, the nuisance abatement, all these things. They basically initiated from here, South Euclid or Shaker Heights, right? Possibly Lakewood, all similar aged communities having similar trouble or struggles, right? Similar style houses. But my thought is that we could simplify some of the process. So when I see their registration and then I look back to ours, it seems like when we do our process review, there could be some innovation there to make it flow a little better, right? So are we asking the right questions on the forms? And sometimes they get a little confusing, you get lost in the weeds. We may be asking a few too many questions.
Is that something that you can do like within the office, or do you think that there's anything that council would need to do to like enable you to do that?
So, I mean, my thought would be to, do a entire review of the whole housing code, right? And how it fits now, determine whether or not we keep our local code or we go with the national code. And even with the building department, going through the whole building code, trying to review the fee structure of the building code, right? Does that fit? I don't know if we, with our new guest today, if we want to. No, okay, but there's the building department needs their codes reviewed too, right? So housing, building, zoning has already gone through their zoning code amendments and made some revisions and again, it's always a living thing, so it changes, but we really haven't done an overhaul of it for quite a while. We've added pieces and we want to make sure those pieces fit together, right? So we keep adding onto a house and by the time you get done with it, you don't know how to get out.
Yep.
Right? So
Out of curiosity, about how long do you think that it's been since we had like a holistic overview of them? Like 5 years, 10 years, more?
I don't know. I don't think that we've done a whole overview of ours, the housing code, for quite a while.
Okay.
Probably since we've added the nuisance abatement was probably back in the early 90s.
Okay.
Building code, I think, had an update probably then too, as far as prices, but that was about it. Changing from a local code to a national code with the building as well. We went from a regional dwelling house code to the Ohio building code.
Okay.
How's compliance with the foreclosure bond coming? Are we getting better at that, or are they getting?
I haven't done a recent check on it, but they continually come in for release, right? Release requests. Okay. We continually get the checks come in, and the process is working. I have to do a review on to see how many there are, and I'm onboarding a new property investigator. So he's working through some NST pretty well. Yeah, so we'll get up going. But again, they're working. If we have the bond, right, then that's a good thing. We're using it, and they're usually taking care of the property.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Well, I don't know if this is a question exactly, but it seems to me that, and I understand what you're saying about, we gotta decide what we can do, what's doable staffing wise. But by the same token, we council and our budget authority, we have to figure out what we think needs to be done and what we wanna fund. I wouldn't wanna just throw my hands up in the air and say, well, we don't have the people. If there's things that the department wants to do, that the directors agree ought to be done, we have to look at the budget and what we may wanna refocus. If we think, vacant and abandoned properties, sections of the city need a Marshall Plan of some sort, and the only way it's ever going to happen is if we, move some resources around. That's something we need to look at, and obviously we need to do that in conjunction with the administration.
Okay.
And the mayor. It's a policy thing, but it's something we should be thinking about like now.
Yeah.
Because the budget thing comes up quick.
Okay, well, Director Zamp, Director Butler, thank you so much for providing that overview. Really appreciate it. So now let's skip down to the third item on the agenda. So today, Gary Benjamin and Melody Hart are joining us to share some legislative ideas with us. So I'll turn it over to you. And I think that we have printouts of the drafts. And okay, is there anyone who would like?
Better for old people.
Consistent. And should,
Lonnie grabbed it right away. We'll hand them out while we're doing this. So this is from Racial Justice Task Force. We were to figure out what disparities we saw in the city racially and ways we might remedy those, alleviate them. Some of the research I did, I was really surprised that I knew that we were affected by race here and that since 1950, we've been losing population and the median income had been dropping. Both of them, interestingly, were 60,000 people and the 40,000. And the median income was the same. So, but in the Black community, the other thing we found was the median income is $20,000 different between the white community and the Black community. Housing ownership is flipped around. 60% of white residents own, 40% of Black residents own. And what's good about that is we're better than the national average on that one, but not on any of the others. So we were looking at that, and some of the work we'd done, some of us in the past, like with GCC, we had learned that investors are coming in, especially for low value houses, low property value houses at 100,000 and below, and paying cash. And then renting them out and sitting on them and not taking care of them. I was just talking to Diana Woodbridge today. She'd gone through the sales. Somehow she gets the list of sales for a week or a month or something. She said 20% of them were for houses at 100,000 or less. Banks do not typically give mortgages for that small an amount. So probably most of these are cash sales or land contract or something like that. And most of those were north of Mayfield. So the investors are still hunting up north particularly. So we took all that into account and tried to figure out ways to solve the problem of, I see Anthony's name came up. Housing stock is important to the city, but it's especially important to renters. The other thing Melody and I did when we had our Haitian friend looking for an apartment was we went to apartment buildings on Noble, and there weren't any that we would even consider. He has plenty of money, he's a good job. And when I was a magistrate, there were a couple people that owned 2 or 3 buildings on Noble Road that showed up more than once in those 20 months. So I think that there's a place to focus there and a real problem that affects the Black, particularly the rental community more than the homeowners, I think, is that the housing code isn't enforced. Well, it isn't able to be enforced as well. It's one of the things we looked at. And we talked to Alan and we talked to the judge and some other people involved in housing enforcement and came up with some ideas. Reggie Evans was on the committee and I think he's chief inspector at Shaker. So some of these ideas came from him, and he's in North Carolina today and says his regrets. Rhonda Davis Lovejoy is in Michigan for work and says her regrets as well. So my own view of structural racism, that at heart it's about wealth and property. And the housing values in Black neighborhoods tend to be lower than those in white neighborhoods, even where the housing stock is similar. And so we came up with some strategies, some of which I think are easy and some are not. So going through this longer document, the ordinance sets up what has to be in a notice, a violation notice. So first, this title's a little misleading because number 2 is to give notice that there's also a civil option for enforcement, so that the housing department could choose to do this on a civil basis rather than a criminal basis. Our notion there was that a lot of people stay in their houses maybe longer than we should, maybe they don't want to move, and a house starts to crumble around them and they're out of money because they're senior citizens and on a fixed income. Those people show up in court and they end up right now with a criminal violation. And that just doesn't feel right. So rather than do that, we talked about doing civil violations. The department can determine which case to do civilly and which to do criminally. And I don't know if you can do both at once, but I don't know if it's a prohibition to do both at once, but that's a possibility. And then section 1 is based on what was going on with ARPA funding, that there was a fund set aside. Yep.
Before you go into section 1, Gary, question about the definition of the smaller rental units, 3 units in a building and smaller, which many are owned residents of the city. Is there a way to make sure that the LLCs that own single-family units will still be subject to stricter regulation?
Which one are you on?
The whereas smaller rental units, it's the last whereas. I only printed out the one that.
Problem ordinance draft?
Ordinance providing for additional tools for the city to enforce housing code against landlords.
Yeah. That one, okay, which whereas?
The last one right before section 1.
That was because we got some pushback on this from landlords who own smaller buildings. Now, these are the mom and pop landlords, Helen Hertz to be exact.
Okay.
And she didn't want to be subject to this.
So I think
We were really, that's open to negotiation as far as I'm concerned. We're not putting anything in stone here. This is just, our process was to ask people who might not like this what they thought and to try to deal with it. But we were really focusing on bigger buildings.
Yeah.
Because of the Noble Road thing and the bad landlord that was in court got the $3,000 fine. I threatened to name this after him at one point. But so this particular, we're talking about the problem landlord ordinance is what I call it. You have it as something else.
Page 4 of the.
Anyway, and it has some ideas as to what to do with problem landlords, and that is that they have more than one building that have violations in I think it's a 2-year period. We add up the points, and the court would be, the city would be authorized to charge them and the court to go ahead against them aggregating their buildings. Right now, what they do is they get different LLCs. And especially if this was a civil violation, I think the court could, under the joinder rules of civil procedure, say, I'm gonna go ahead against this as a single person because a single person owns all the LLCs. That's something for Bill to weigh in on, but that was our thought on that. So this just gives another tool and it's heavier handed. I think it doubles the fines and it, it just talks about what a problem landlord is. And that was based partly on Reggie and me talking about what we were seeing. And the committee we had tenants on it, 2 tenants. And it had 2 young people who had been tenants and just bought houses in Cleveland Heights. So a lot of this was informed by what those 4 people had been going through. One of them was going through a problem with his landlord while we were doing this stuff. So that's the thinking there. But there are, as you say, LLCs that own single family houses. So that can go either way as far as I'm concerned. But
Somehow if you could work it into the definition, with the exception of.
yeah, well, I don't think that a landlord who lives in one half of the house or who
Yeah.
owns a place down the street.
Yeah.
I mean, I've had some of those come into the court before, but they seem to keep their places up.
Yeah.
Because if they let them run down, all our neighbors are gonna be all over them for one thing, and for another, their property value could drop, so there's a real interest there. The problem might be that they don't have the money to fix it, but that's, that's a different problem that is solved by having a fund, which is another thing we suggested. And I think there was $2 million or something set aside for that, to help people who can't afford to repair their houses. But they have to know about that, so back to where I started, this would give them notice that the city's got money right in the notice of violation. So it's both a notice of violation and a ticket. A good ticket. And the second,
Yeah.
sorry.
This is for Director Hannah. If we can implement a civil penalty, which Melody talked about often and we talked about in GCC often, does the judge a prosecutor make the decision as to whether it will be treated as a criminal or a civil offense in the court?
I'm actually not prepared to respond to that tonight.
Okay.
Because I wanted to understand what these recommendations were. And then if council is interested in further, exploring these issues, we can do some further research, look at templates, follow up with Gary, and otherwise be in a position to respond.
That's fair, thank you.
These first 2 kind of track what Sally Martin did.
Yeah.
There. They set aside 30 million or something, and it was a really big pot of money for Cleveland to do house repairs. And they did go through for the civil penalty. I don't know, Ellen was gonna check with Warrensville, they had a civil penalty in their ordinance, but we weren't sure they were using it. I don't know if you ever figured that out, I didn't, I know.
They do have a civil penalty. I can't recall
Yeah,
for what degree of,
it's very simple, it just says we have a civil penalty or something in their ordinance.
similar to what they were stating here for certain violations or.
Right. So the third one allows equitable action by the city. This doesn't really frankly do anything that they can't do now, I think. It kind of encourages the city to use things like receivership or ordinance or injunctions type thing to get people to fix. I know the judge uses injunctions now, essentially his orders to fix it up are injunctions, they say, fix it. And I believe there's a receivership working its way through the system in our court, private receivership. So,
And the
I don't
existing
think the
code
city's-
does, I'm sorry.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, the existing code does have a provision addressing that, essentially, that other actions aren't precluded. That's
Right.
134511.
Yeah, we just built on that a little bit. And then the fourth one is amending the penalty provisions title a bit. I don't know if it changes anything exactly, but the imposition of penalties under this provision does not preclude the law director from instituting civil actions for violations of the building or housing code, including asking for a receiver. So the two together, the idea was to at least authorize that. The city's been reluctant to ask for receivers because it's kind of a pain, to say the least. But it's also, in some cases, it's happened in Cleveland 7 or 8 times that I know of. And I think it's gonna happen here with this one that's pending. So it's, I don't know a whole lot about it other than Ben Greenberg is gonna be the receiver if it happens.
Is it a pain for the city administration, or, because I know it's a complicated process for the receiver, but, because, you have a lawyer and, all kinds of.
It takes legal time, it's a separate expertise.
For the
Law department.
yeah.
Right. And, it might be worth doing. At one point, Startright was looking at having receiverships up there more, and I think they decided not to do it, but he made a list of places that would benefit if it worked. Receivership requires a real strong financial analysis though, because what happens is a receiver is appointed, the receiver makes the repairs, put the receiver's money into it to do that, so the city would also be putting money in to make the repairs if it was the receiver and acting as a contractor or hiring a contractor out is what usually happens. And then once it's all done, the court says, okay, the receivership is lifted, but something has to happen to pay the receiver back with a profit. And that can be one of 2 or 3 things, but the main ones that are done is they sell the place, and if it's worth more, the receiver keeps a chunk of the profit and the owner gets something back, or the receiver just gets title. Maybe they have to pay the owner something, but there's some financial arrangement worked out. But the property's back on the market in good shape. And that's a tool we haven't used that I think would probably do well on Noble Road, actually. We talked about the problem landlord ordinance a little.
We had Alan Greenberg in the housing committee
Yeah,
last
Ben-
year or the year before, and it's really, his knowledge base is really, really,
He's a
Awesome.
national expert.
yeah,
He
and
works for a
he's-
national housing rights firm.
he's doing receiverships often, right? I mean, it's like, he
Yeah,
has the expertise if you ever wanted to explore that.
yeah, Ben would come here. And then the last thing is,
Was there anything more on the problem landlord ordinance that either you wanted to share or anyone had questions about? I think that was.
the penalties are allowed once you hit the definition of problem. More than 5 points from the factors listed in section C in any 2-year period. It's on page 5. Well, yeah, 5 on yours too. Once you hit that, the penalties get pretty heavy. The idea is to encourage landlords not to hit them. And like the foreclosure bond is partially designed for banks not to force people out of the house while they're being foreclosed on, because if it's not vacant, they don't have to pay the bond.
I don't see it in here, and it may be in here, when you've got someone who's in housing court, LLC, in housing court repeatedly, and the COO should be revoked because they have these citations on, already open and they're not complying. That seems to me an area where I'd like to see that tightened up somehow, and I don't know if that, our ordinances already preclude that enough, or if it's just a matter of not having the staff to make sure that that's taking place.
If there's a bunch of violations, that would be a reasonable thing to do,
Yes,
take away the COO.
yes. But then I'm thinking about tracking all of this too. So you have a point system and then you have,
Some of this in court, the judge has hired a bailiff to do housing. And I'm hoping, he's hoping, I know, that the bailiff is gonna have enough expertise and they can track the court stuff with that staff person. That's his notion.
and then stay in contact with the housing and building department.
Well, the other thing is, it's a small enough court that you know who the frequent flyers are. So if they're there a lot and they've got a lot of violations, all you gotta do really is go try to quantify it, and that's something that can be done, I mean, relatively simply from that court's database. I use that database a lot, and even I could figure it out. But yeah, having a COO thing in there would be a good idea. So before I get to the apartment buildings on civic engagement, let me go to this piece here. Reggie had this idea that I thought was brilliant. Whether it works or not is, we kind of decided we thought it would, and hopefully it wasn't wishful thinking. But the idea would be that a tenant, prospective tenant, would be treated similarly to a prospective owner. And if you bought a house, you know, you get a package of papers that includes everything that ever went wrong with it in the last 5 years, or is supposed to. It includes whether there's lead paint, you know, and it just includes all of that. Was there ever, like the house we just moved into, and our plumber came into it, the first time he came back to fix something, he walked through our kitchen and said, last time I was in here, it was raining. So that we didn't know, but that kind of stuff is supposed to be on there. So the idea would be have such a form attached to every lease, or actually given to the tenant before they sign a lease so that they know what the problems are. I thought it was a good idea for a lot of reasons, and one of Reggie's incentives was that he said, you know, it's pretty hard to hire enough inspectors to inspect everything in a city where the housing is 100 years old or more. It's just very hard to do that. But this would require the landlord to do it, to tell the tenant, prospective tenant, what is there. And the penalty down the road could be a number of things, but one of the things could be if the landlord tries to evict you and they don't have this form up front, that's a defense. You know, and it wouldn't just be the defense of there's a problem of habitability, the way the statute says it, go beyond that. And it'd be taken as part of the contract. There are probably other penalties that would be less controversial, but the idea would be that it may result in the lease itself being invalidated or something similar. It could just be a fine as well, but the idea was the landlord for each unit has to have a form. I did run this by a couple of landlords who didn't like the idea of all the paperwork, especially if they own a lot of places. But they thought about it a minute and they said, you know, once we get it done, it's good for 5 years. And it's not that hard to update. You know, just something happens, you do a new form, and then when you're ready to rent it, you've got the form there. It's fairly bureaucratic in a way, but the idea was, and I haven't seen anybody do this, neither did Reggie. So it's an original, it would be a Cleveland Heights original if we decided to do that.
So I understand the concept, and I remember looking at it at one of the meetings.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is if a landlord doesn't disclose everything in the form and they both sign it, and then, you know, there's like some dispute down the road. Oh, this was here when I moved in. No, it wasn't. You know, and then you got this, you know, similar kind of thing as like when, you know, nobody takes pictures for, you know, when they move in, and, you know, and it's, you know, you try to prove who did what when in court. I guess what I'm wondering is who polices the, what's on the form? I mean, I understand the landlord's responsible for populating it, but who polices the accuracy of that?
That would really only come up, I mean, this is one where we weren't trying to lay a lot of burdens on the city, trying to take it off in a little way. It wouldn't come up unless there was a regular inspection that showed a bunch of stuff wrong and the tenant goes, wait a minute, he said my house was clean.
Right.
That would happen. I could see that happening. Or there's some kind of a lawsuit, like an eviction case, or the landlord says, you did this or this or this to my, I had 20 or 30 of these when I was on the bench, where the landlord claimed the tenant did X, and the tenant said, no, I didn't do X. The landlord withheld the security deposit, and then there's a dispute over who's right, pretty much. And I know you would look for pictures or objective proof. So what I'd do is I'd have Alan send somebody over there to inspect the place, and then they'd tell me from a third-party perspective what's wrong and what's not. Sometimes I found out the landlords were just not telling the truth about something being wrong too, so. That's the only way I see it really being policed. I don't see it coming up any other way. It'd be in the context of an enforcement.
Is there a penalty for
We're lying?
for not disclosing?
Not complying.
Yeah. And you could put a similar penalty on this.
It seems that people who are tenants should be as well protected as those of us who are buying a house where we have to have there is a disclosure form of sorts, and it obviously can be manipulated too, but I'm particularly interested in the number one because of the example next door to me where the owner cannot be found, does not have an address in this country. And
Next
so,
door, the one in back got torn down, right?
yeah, but this person lives, I'm assuming, in a foreign country, and when you do a search on the business registered with the state of Ohio, it's just that person's name, and you never see any information about them ever again. So this ties into that legislation in the Senate right now, where they're going to, if it passes, they will require that people who own rental property must have their location,
Name and contact info.
name and contact
Yeah.
info. So.
Even that's hard to police.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if this couldn't flush out a few of these people that are hard to pin down when they've got property they're not taking care of.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your comment because that's where we were coming from. Homeowners tend to be white, renters tend to be black, homeowners get a disclosure form,
Yeah.
tenants don't.
Yeah.
Just a disconnect there.
Yeah.
The other thing, under the civil option, we had some discussions of this, but we weren't really sure what to do with it. There is such a thing as in rem service, which means you're serving the thing. So if the owner is absent, under a civil option, I believe what you could do is put the ticket on the door. And the court would say, okay, I now have jurisdiction over the house. I don't care where the owner is. At that point, that's when you probably need a receiver too, or some sort of way to get the house fixed without the owner being actively involved. But you'd have jurisdiction and the court might be able to move forward that way. Then this is not in the Cleveland plan, nor is our harsher penalty provision.
Okay.
So I put the draft access to apartment buildings for civic engagement piece together with this because it seemed like it was housing. It might go somewhere else, I don't know. It's the other thing we thought was that tenants don't have as much political clout as owners. And part of that is because tenants don't tend to vote. You obviously are an exception. So that is a problem politically for me in many of my hats. But one of them the tenants are mostly black, and that means that that's a disparity. One of the issues is I know people who own homes and don't like canvassers might not agree with me saying this, but canvassing is important. Getting out there with stuff to hand to people, that's an important thing to do, especially to register them to vote. Though tenants register in higher percentages than they vote, but they're both low numbers compared to homeowners. And just getting registered tenants out to vote would be a big deal. And this has been tried in Minnesota, only for voter registration. We drafted this broader so that it would also be voter education. Some places don't have a common place for people to set up a table and talk to folks, and that might have to be door to door. But I know everybody at this table, 5 of us anyway, have done canvassing. And you try to get into apartment buildings and it's just ridiculous, unless you have someone inside to open the door, which is the gold standard. This would set up a system, and it would have a burden on the city because someone would have to decide which canvassers are okay and which canvassers aren't, and issue a badge or something to go in. The Minnesota piece did it a little differently. The Board of Elections did all of that, so it didn't fall on a city, but I don't know that our Board of Elections, we're not a whole county, we're just a city. I don't know.
It's a
that
state
they-
statute, is it not? in
It's, no, I think it was the county, whatever county Minneapolis is in.
Hennepin.
So
I can send that to you.
we have just a few minutes left before we have to turn the room over to the Charter Review Commission. So are there any other questions for Gary or Melody? Councilman Maddox, are you able to hear us okay? I should have asked sooner, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. I appreciate it. I just wanted to say again to Gary and Melody, this is some great work. A lot of great conversations happening. I didn't want to interrupt the presentation, and I know we're going to have a more robust conversation around some of the research and work later. But I did want you guys to know I did hear that, and I definitely appreciate it.
Mr. Chairman,
Yeah, of course.
the question I had is, these proposals were described as emanating from the Racial Justice Task Force. I'm wondering if there's a report that sort of embodies all of the analysis around this and pulls it together, or is that essentially what we're looking at here, the compilation summary memo?
Yeah, I have a statistical memo I did that wasn't ever officially adopted.
Okay.
We decided to adopt remedies. That's what we were there for. So we did our analysis, we talked about it, we got a common basis to go from. I can send you that.
Okay, sure.
It comes out of I don't know if all 3 of you know that the city every 3 to 5 years does a report to HUD about furthering fair housing in Cleveland Heights. A lot of our analysis came out of the last one of those. It was filed in 2020. It's part of the HUD statute that says that if you get HUD money, you have to affirmatively further fair housing. And the report is to tell HUD that you're doing that and how you're doing that. And the last one came up with some things. I think pay to stay was in it. Can't remember now, I read it so long ago, but there were things in it. Source of income discrimination was in it. So the city's responded to things in that report historically, but I don't know if council automatically gets that. That would be a good thing to get your hands on.
Might be due for another one. The last one was 2020.
I don't know if we know that. That's Brian Iorio does them. So I don't know when it's due. Last time they contracted with the Fair Housing Center. I've got it if anybody wants the last one. Maybe that's what I'll send you because it's really where we came from.
I apologize for being unusually silent, but since he's the chair of the Racial Justice Task Force Housing Committee, I thought it most appropriate for him.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, appreciate it. Any other questions? We have one other thing on the agenda and just a few minutes left, so. Okay, so the last thing that we have on our agenda, Councilwoman Larson recently went to a conference and she was kind enough to pull together some takeaways. And so I asked if she'd be interested in sharing with us.
Sorry, we need to go.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Children come first.
Councilor Russell and I attended the National League of Cities on March 10th through the 13th, and it was a very well organized and informative conference that I hope to attend again next year. Federal agencies were available during the day. They were coming into the conference center because we were in Washington DC after all, and attendees could stop in and talk to aides from those agencies regarding their municipality issues and what the opportunities are for funding, which was the most interesting part. I attended a deep dive session that covered federal opportunities for funding, water infrastructure, revitalizing brownfield properties, improving solid waste management, and increasing access to parks and outdoor rec. Another deep dive that I attended focused on advancing local action on climate change and community resilience. The final deep dive covered the topics of assessing federal transportation grants and opportunities for our communities. The opportunities for networking with other city council members were endless. Additionally, I made a contact with the NLC Director of Housing and Development, Lauren Lowry. She was very interested in providing any help she could regarding our city's enforcement of housing and building codes to improve poorly maintained single-family dwellings and apartment buildings. So you can hear what I was talking to her about. A brief list of resources includes landlord engagement resources, strategic code enforcement and rental registry resources, land bank resources, community land trust resources. Lauren also gave me a list of programs to provide federal funding for rehab, repair, and acquisition. And they provide technical assistance. I would say that for me, the opportunity to network with other council members was extremely important. We talk about that when we go to conferences with the Ohio Municipal League too. And I hope that we can put that in the budget, that we can become a member of National League of Cities for 2025, and that we can still continue to get the support financially for the council, at least get their registration reimbursed, because it is quite expensive. So that's what I have to say. If anybody wants to talk to me about some of that stuff, welcome to have coffee.
Great.
Okay?
Any questions for Councilwoman Larson? Any other comments? Okay, well, with that, I will adjourn today's meeting.
Thank you.